Hello, hello, and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and we are headed back to McLean Hospital today to learn more about the history of the institution and how it became known as a healing site for the wealthy. We're also going to spend some time talking about one memorable patient and how he ended up at McLean. Trigger warnings for this episode include the use of outdated and ableist language, sexual language, and mention of suicide attempts. My main sources will be the book Gracefully Insane by Alex Beam, a lecture on the founding and history of McLean Hospital given by archivist Jerry Bragg, and annual reports from the hospital itself. All other sources will be listed at the end of the episode transcript. So for now, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of McLean Hospital. We left off last time in 1896 during a period of growth for the hospital. New private residences for wealthier patients had been constructed, a nursing school was established, and a research lab created. Dr. Edward Coles was superintendent at that time. The hospital had just moved to the Belmont site the previous year. According to the 1896 annual report, the most, quote, striking event of the year was the celebration of the semi-centennial of anesthesia on October 16th, 1896. And oh boy, did they get excited about it. That day was, per the report, the 50th anniversary of the day on which occurred at the Massachusetts General Hospital the first public demonstration of surgical anesthesia, an event which settled for all time the future of anesthesia. There were prestigious visitors, there were speeches, there were poems, all in celebration of the new medical phenomenon. And I suppose if you had to live and get operated on in a time before anesthesia, you'd probably get really excited about it too. The nursing school was growing with 72 nurses in regular training during the year and 32 who had graduated. There were instructors in massage, cooking, and dietetics for holistic practice. Remember that McLean was founded on the principles of moral treatment, so non-pharmacological approaches were preferred. The nursing school was a 2-year program, and the school had a preference for trainees between the ages of 25 and 35, and who had a reference who could speak to their moral character. If the nurses made it past their first probationary month, they signed a written agreement to complete the next 2 years of training. The instruction included the following, quote, Number 1, the dressing of burns, sores, and wounds, the preparation and application of fomentations, poultices, cups, leeches, and of minor dressings. I'm actually surprised that leeches were still being used at this time during the end of the 19th century. Number 2, the administration of enemata with the use of the catheter and the giving of baths. 3, the principles of massage with practical workings. Number 4, the care of the patient's room, the making of beds, the principles of ventilation, and their practical application. 5, the management and care of helpless patients, the prevention and treatment of bed sores. Number 6, the manufacture of bandages, the application of bandages and splints. Number 7, emergencies and their treatment. Number 8, the preparation, cooking, and serving of food, the use of stimulants, end quote. Now, to my surprise, most of the lessons were offered by the head superintendent. Of course, there were other lead nurses who were involved in instruction, but I'm really surprised that the superintendent was available to offer so many lessons. Nurses under probation earned $10 per month and $14 per month during their second year of training. They were expected to live on campus at the hospital and pay for their own nursing uniform, a cost of up to $12. Patient admissions to McLean required applications that would only be accepted during 9 to 11 a.m. and 2 to 3 p.m. on weekdays only, with the exception of patients who had been involved in an accident. Fees were as follows. In the private Jackson ward, $35 a week. A small room in the Townsend and Bigelow wards, $25 a week. And in the general wards, $10 a week. Now compare that to the nurse's salary of $10 a month, and you get a sense of how expensive the stay would be. Also in 1896, the men's wing was renamed Proctor House after the late Thomas E. Proctor, who had been a trustee and benefactor of the hospital. The women's wing had been given the name Wyman House in recognition of the former superintendent Dr. Rufus Wyman and all his achievements. McLean was open to patients of all ages, from infants to the elderly. In fact, in cases where infants and children were admitted to the hospital, their mothers often accompanied them. According to the 1896 annual report, quote, "It is believed that the effect of having both old and young in the hospital is mutually beneficial. To make sure that the young children shall not miss the care to which they are accustomed, the mothers are, in suitable cases, received into the hospital together with the children," end quote. This is different than other asylums, where children and infants were expected to be taken care of by other women patients. By 1897, there were 227 patients at the hospital. Of that number, there were still quite a few indigent patients. The greatest number of paying patients at one time was 106, of which 8 were in private rooms. The greatest number of free patients was 162. By the following year in 1898, there were 246 patients, showing that the hospital was growing steadily, but not astronomically as the nearby state hospitals were. Still, by 1899, the new hospital had already reached its maximum capacity and was looking to send out patients to other nearby facilities. The primary treatment modalities during this time included regular baths, including those like caged showers with all the nozzles, sports and exercise groups, carving and woodworking classes, art classes, billiard games, religious services, and trips to the library. By the turn of the 20th century, the number of patients was steadily growing. By 1905, there was an average of 305 patients at McLean. That particular year, 65 cases had to be turned away due to lack of room. Remember that the publicly funded state hospitals were unable to turn away patients, which is why overcrowding became such an enormous problem for them. McLean, being privately funded, was able to pick and choose who was admitted and how many they were able to accommodate, so their numbers were able to stay relatively low. A change in the law that year meant there would be increases in voluntary patients, which initially worried staff at McLean. But in 1905, only 55 of the 120 patients admitted were voluntary, which was in line with the previous year's average. By 1906, the nursing school had expanded, and it became necessary for the training program to increase from a 2-year program to a 3-year program. This was a significant change for the hospital, but they felt it necessary in order to provide the best training possible. In 1906, a well-known patient checked into McLean. His name was Stanley McCormick, and he was the son of Cyrus McCormick, who had invented the combine harvester. At the time, Cyrus McCormick was one of the wealthiest men in the U.S. McCormick had had 3 sons and 2 daughters. According to Alex Beam in Gracefully Insane, Stanley was the youngest of the boys and known as the, quote, sensitive one. And this raises a red flag to me as someone who studies folks with autism, because sensitive is one of the common descriptors of children who go on to receive an autism diagnosis. So just keep that in mind as we discuss Stanley McCormick. His mother, Nettie, put Stanley in private schools in Chicago, and as Alex Beam writes, quote, smothered him with maternal care. When her children misbehaved, she locked them in a dark closet. Stanley's sister, Mary Virginia, had what they described as a psychotic breakdown and never appeared in society again. Obviously, wealthy families could not bear to have, quote, sick children, regardless of their age. Stanley initially did not have as obvious of a disorder as Mary Virginia. Here's how Alex Beam describes him. Quote, he attended Princeton, played tennis marvelously, and studied art. Stanley talked about becoming an artist and even attended an art school in Paris after his college graduation. But family pressure directed him to the McCormick Harvest Machine Company, later International Harvester, where he sat on the board of directors and occupied various executive posts. Stanley was bright and quick with numbers, but he struggled in his assignments. He agonized over decisions. Underlings, sometimes frustrated by weeks' delay in the most routine deliberations, circumvented him and complained about his behavior to his brothers. Judging from the numerous psychiatric reports written during Stanley's 41 years of mental illness, he suffered partly from what we now call an obsessive-compulsive disorder. And just as a side note, I actually disagree with this. My clinical speculation is that Stanley had autism, which does share some traits with OCD. But we'll see that as his sensory concerns, social difficulties, and distress intolerance lead me to believe that he was probably on the spectrum. Okay, I return to the quote. His McLean write-up notes that he kept 6 or 8 different weights of underwear, and he had certain range of temperature for each set, and every morning it was almost impossible for him to decide what the temperature was going to be and which set of underclothing would be the proper one. Tall, handsome, and athletic, the young Stanley McCormick never felt particularly well. Working for the fast-growing family harvester business overwhelmed him. More than once, a family doctor diagnosed nervous prostration, and Stanley even bought a 45,000-acre ranch in New Mexico to serve as a sanctuary from the press of worldly concerns. One day in the summer of 1903, he reported looking in the mirror and seeing only a blank, end quote. Given this information, I really think he may have fallen on the autism spectrum. He may have fallen in what we call today level 1 autism, which does not require lots of support. They can still live independently, but everyday tasks can become overwhelming, and autistic burnout can become debilitating. When Stanley was 28 years old, he reunited with a childhood acquaintance named Catherine Dexter. Catherine was the daughter of a prominent Chicago lawyer, and she was about to enter her senior year at MIT. She was definitely a catch, and Stanley pursued her relentlessly, if not unconventionally. He was socially awkward, and he made inappropriate confessions to the woman he was hoping to woo by telling her about his compulsive masturbation problem and the device he made to help curb that issue. Catherine was not impressed by Stanley, and she fled to her family's chateau in Switzerland to get away from him. Because who doesn't have a family chateau in Switzerland to escape on a whim? Stanley, in a desperate attempt to stop Catherine from leaving, quote, accosted her on the wharf of New York and told her that a leading urologist had given his genitalia a clean bill of health, end quote. You mean that doesn't work? That doesn't woo all the women? I can imagine Catherine rolling her eyes as she stepped onto the ship into Switzerland. But of course, Stanley could not be stopped. He followed her to Europe and eventually wore Catherine down. She agreed to marry him, and they were wed in Geneva. Alex Beam writes, quote, although the honeymoon lasted for 9 months, the marriage was never consummated. The presence of their respective mothers during parts of the trip could not have helped. Most nights, Stanley refused to come to bed, scribbling letters until dawn. When he tried to make love with Catherine, he failed, blaming either his youthful masturbation or a sexual encounter he may or may not have had with a Parisian prostitute several years earlier. End quote. Of course, there were questions about Stanley's sexuality too, but he never wrote about any of that, and Catherine did not divulge. More likely, in my view, it was his social difficulties that likely led to his abstinence. Well, we'll likely never know. By 1906, Stanley's symptoms were more pronounced than ever. He and Catherine had returned to the States but were living apart. Him working for Harvester in Chicago and Catherine living in Boston. But by 1906, he was forced to resign and move to live with Catherine in Boston. Then pressure began to create an heir. Despite their attempts, an heir was not produced. Stanley consulted a friend of Catherine's family who advised him to take fencing lessons and study German in order to clear his mind. This did not work. What's worse, Stanley became violent. Alex Beam notes, quote, "A few days later, Stanley assaulted a dentist whom he had allowed to pull a tooth without using anesthesia. Then he attacked an elevator operator, and he subsequently dragged a German tutor out of his office and into the McCormick home to administer the prescribed lessons. On the night of October 16th, Catherine took him to McLean." End quote. His presentation and admission to McLean sounds downright psychotic to me, as if he were experiencing visual and auditory hallucinations. Beam writes, quote, "With the admitting doctors, Stanley was alternately pugnacious and delusional. While looking into vacancy, he explained, 'Jack London, I'm glad to see you.' When no one had spoken, he repeatedly said, 'Who is calling me?' When restrained in bed, he shouted, 'To Windsor! To Windsor!' His cause of insanity was listed as hereditary, noting that the entire family had a nervous temperament. His mother was eccentric and his sister insane. The diagnosis given was, quote, 'manic depressive, ? Dementia praecox, ? Fixed ideas, ? End quote. Without more information than just this snapshot, it's possible that they were looking at someone with a comorbid diagnosis of schizophrenia and autism. Plenty of people believe these disorders cannot coexist, but I see it every day, so I think it does. Still, it's impossible to completely diagnose someone in retrospect, but I can clinically speculate on what may have been going on with Stanley McCormick. Stanley was admitted to one of the private, luxurious suites in Upham Memorial Hall. For a while, he did well. By late October, a couple weeks after his admission, doctors reported a, quote, "period of steady improvement. Patient perfectly clear, natural in attitude, showed good insight, and discussed his symptoms frankly, gaining in weight and sleeping well." End quote. But that improvement would be short-lived, and his symptoms would return. Beam writes, quote, "But in what would soon become a pattern, his clear periods were interrupted by episodes of abnormal behavior. His wife's visits sometimes upset him. In conversations with his doctor, Gilbert von Tassel Hamilton, Stanley confessed that he had been impotent in his marriage. He remarked that nurses were calling him a dog, and in response, he put his plate on the ground and lapped up his food with his tongue. He masturbated openly and flew into a rage when nurses tried to stop him. Then a major setback occurred in December. Even though he admitted that he could feed himself, he chose to be fed through a tube forced down his esophagus. He attacked a doctor and tried to hang himself with the drawstring of his pajamas. That was viewed as a feeble suicide gesture because he was never left alone. End quote. Some of this behavior, like lapping up food like a dog, could be considered disorganized behavior if he actually had schizophrenia. Disorganized behavior is anything that would be considered odd by neurotypical standards. Things like walking in a strange way or digging through the trash, making odd hand gestures, and so on. There are, of course, other explanations for these types of behavior, but generally speaking, they get clumped into disorganized behavior. By the winter of 1906, Stanley was not doing well, and there became a face-off between his wife Catherine and his mother Nettie regarding who would be responsible for his care. Both sides were at odds with what was best for Stanley, and both argued about who would take care of him. Despite their marital issues, Catherine proved to be a good and faithful caretaker of Stanley. She demanded, and received, daily written reports from Superintendent Tuttle and was very involved in his care. Nettie McCormick blamed Catherine for the breakdown altogether. Alex Beam quotes Nettie in a letter to a friend, quote, "We feel that heretofore in his times of perplexity and uncertain health, Kay did not evince devotion to him, and did not in illness tenderly watch over him, and has not appeared that she was proud of him." End quote. The battle over his care between Catherine and Stanley's mother and sister would end up lasting 40 years. The competing sides were able to agree on one thing. They both wanted consultation on his case from Dr. Adolf Meyer, who was a preeminent psychiatrist at the time. We've mentioned Dr. Meyer a few times on the show. Most notably, he was a mentor to Dr. Henry Cotton from the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum, the man who believed pulling teeth was a form of treatment. Dr. Meyer met with Stanley and reported the following about the patient, quote, "He had an early center of trouble in the excessive development of frustrated sexual functions. He had an excessive sensitiveness in his adjustment to his mother, the business responsibilities, and rather abstract standards of a socialist and moral religious system of accounting for everything. Under the strain of special conflicts, the patient went through courtship and marriage only to find himself utterly unable to cope with the new problems, not at all sexually, and socially only with a hopeless expense of energy." End quote. I feel like a broken record, but I genuinely believe that this man likely had autism rather than OCD. Dr. Meyer's final line that Stanley was only able to cope socially with a hopeless expense of energy really embodies a lot of the experience of people with autism. This isn't to say that they can't socialize. They can, of course, but sometimes at great expense to their own energy, especially if they are masking or mirroring to fit in with the crowd. After the consult with Dr. Meyer, Catherine and Stanley's family were once again at odds regarding his care. Catherine wanted to keep him at McLean. His mother wanted to bring over either Viennese Dr. Richard von Kraft-Ebing or French Dr. Valentin Magnin to treat him privately. And Nettie had all sorts of intervention ideas for Stanley. She wanted him to receive static electricity treatment as she had. In her words, quote, "I have also benefited from static electricity. I sit in a chair and a wire arrangement shaped just like a simple crown or cap is swung above my head after I sit down, and the current is turned on until a pricking sensation is produced. It is the most sleep-producing treatment I have here. It soothes." End quote. She also recommended an oxygen cure, which she described as follows, quote, "Can you not devise a purely oxygen cure for him? That is, live in a cloth room, with one side removed, adjacent to a closed room with fire warmth. Then live in the cloth room, having it warmed if needed, but live in the cloth room most of the time. He gets little but oxygen, the real article." End quote. She also recommended just rubbing one of his legs with cool water, just one leg below the knee, she said, and then the next day they could do the whole leg. It's no wonder Catherine fought for his care. It would have been easy for Catherine to cut and run, but she didn't. In the spring of 1907, he hid in the bathroom of a neighboring suite rather than meet with his wife. A few months later, he assaulted Catherine. Together, Catherine and Stanley's family decided to relocate him to a family-owned estate called Riven Rock in Montecito, California. Alex Beam notes that, quote, the gorgeous stone mansion overlooking the sea had initially been purchased as a home for Mary Virginia, who had since been moved to a private sanitarium in Alabama. Catherine lured Dr. Hamilton, who was doing research on primate sexuality, to the West by endowing the nation's first freestanding primate research institute on the estate grounds. Similarly, she convinced two male nurses to pull up stakes and spend what proved to be the rest of their lives caring for her husband. End quote. It wouldn't be too bad of a deal to take care of one patient for the rest of your career in the beautiful Santa Barbara area of California. I'm sure it didn't take too much convincing, but who knows? And also, just as a side note, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry purchased the Chateau of Riven Rock on the property in 2020. So the site continues to house prominent members of society and the ultra-wealthy. Stanley McCormick ended up spending 39 years at Riven Rock. He was diagnosed with catatonic schizophrenia and treated for a while by none other than the infamous Dr. Emil Kraepelin, the psychiatrist who coined the term dementia praecox and was, for all intents and purposes, the foremost expert on schizophrenia at the time. Dr. Kraepelin also recommended that Stanley receive psychoanalysis from Sigmund Freud, although that never actually happened. Stanley's mother, Nettie, was able to see him in 1923 one last time through a crack in the door before her own death. Over the years, Catherine fought with the media over their perception of her and her care for Stanley. Still, she poured money into various research foundations, such as the Neuroendocrine Research Foundation, which was tasked with exploring the role of hormone imbalances in schizophrenic patients. She continued to be wholly devoted to Stanley through it all. Alex Beam says, quote, Catherine never remarried, dividing her time between Montecito, where she monitored Stanley's care from a neighboring estate, and Boston. She used the considerable Dexter McCormick fortunes to become one of the nation's leading philanthropists, endowing the pioneering birth control research of Margaret Sanger and Dr. John Rock, who conducted some of the first field tests of birth control pills. When Stanley died in 1947, his lawyers produced a will scribbled out in longhand from 1906. It proved to be one of the letters that Stanley was writing at night during his honeymoon instead of attending to his wife. He left her everything, an estate then valued at about $35 million. After 4 decades of open warfare with her in-laws, Catherine finally won Stanley back. At the elite Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, she had Stanley's body laid to rest in the Dexter plot, far removed from the McCormicks, end quote. Catherine died in 1967 and left a huge financial trust to the Stanford University Medical School, the Chicago Art Institute, the Chicago and Boston Symphonies, and Boston's Museum of Fine Arts. Beam says, quote, all of the gifts, including the priceless Impressionist paintings she and Stanley had collected on their honeymoon, were made in the name of her late husband. The largest beneficiary in her will was her alma mater, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, end quote. And that's the story of Stanley and Catherine McCormick, one of McLean's earliest prominent residents. I think I'll pause the story of McLean here and pick up next week because there is so much to cover in the next episode that I want it to have its own focus. As always, thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it so much more than you know. Feel free to support the show on Beacons or on Patreon for as little as $3 a month. I haven't done anything on the Patreon page in quite a while, so if you have suggestions for extra content ideas that I could post there, please let me know. Every contribution helps keep the podcast going, so it is very much appreciated. But for now, remember the words of Maya Angelou. Do the best you can till you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.